After the divorce, the house didn't go quiet the way people expect. It didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. I let that silence stretch on purpose. Long enough for him to mistake it for weakness. Long enough for him to believe I had finally given in. I stayed in the same small town, in the same narrow house where the floors remembered every step and winter light arrived late, then slipped away without apology. He moved on easily, carrying comfort with him as if it had always belonged to him. What he never noticed was this: silence doesn't stay still. And patience, when left alone long enough, learns exactly when to speak. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Black ink, thin paper, my name written once more like it was learning how to stand alone. The room was quiet in that careful, professional way. No ticking clock, no windows open. Just the soft slide of papers and the low hum of fluorescent lights above us. I remember thinking how clean everything looked. Too clean for something that was ending. He signed first, confident strokes. No pause. When it was my turn, I hesitated just long enough for the pen to leave a small dent in the page. Then I signed too. No tears. No shaking. Just the sound of ink doing what it was told. The lawyer smiled politely. Said something about moving forward. We shook hands across the desk. His hand was warm. Mine wasn't. He stood up already talking, about traffic, about dinner plans, about a place he wanted to try downtown. He spoke like the world had opened wider for him the moment the papers were done. "I'll be in touch," he said, though his eyes were already elsewhere. I nodded that I always had. Outside, the afternoon light was sharp and cold. He walked ahead of me toward the parking lot, keys already in his hand, phone pressed to his ear. I watched him unlock his car like nothing had changed. Then he drove away. I stood there longer than I needed to, the wind tugging at my coat, the courthouse doors closing softly behind me. When I finally turned toward home, it felt less like returning and more like arriving somewhere new without directions. The house greeted me the way it always had, with a faint creak in the floorboard by the door, with the smell of dust and old wood. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I never did anymore. The lamp by the window was enough. I set my keys in the bowl, took off my shoes, hung my coat carefully, as if noise mattered. Living smaller started that day, not on purpose. Just naturally. I cooked less. Ate at the counter instead of the table. I turned off lights when I left a room, even if I planned to come back. The house learned my quieter footsteps. Neighbors asked how I was doing. I smiled the right amount. "Oh, I'd say, getting by." They nodded, relieved by the simplicity of the answer. No one wants the full truth in passing. They just want to know you won't make them uncomfortable. At night, the sounds grew louder. The clock in the hallway ticked like it was counting something important. The pipes clicked and sighed when the heat came on. Sometimes the refrigerator hummed so steadily it felt like company. I lay in bed listening to my own breathing, noticing how loud it sounded in the dark. In the space beside me, the mattress stayed flat and cool. He never asked how I was sleeping. Days settled into routine. Mornings with pale light slipping through the curtains. Afternoons spent sorting things that didn't need sorting. Evenings that came too early in winter. I found myself touching objects more carefully, cups, door handles, the back of a chair. As if everything was more fragile now that it was mine alone. Once, I opened the closet and noticed how much space his clothes had taken. Not just physically, but in the way I'd arranged myself around them. I closed the door without changing anything. Some absences take time to name. He sent a message a week later. "Hope you're doing okay. Busy couple of days. Life's been full." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table. Silence, I was learning, doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it's a decision. I didn't explain myself. Not to him. Not to anyone. I let days pass without filling them with reasons. There was a kind of strength in that I hadn't expected. One evening, I stood at the sink watching water run over my hands, listening to the steady rush. The light outside had gone blue, that in-between color where everything feels unfinished. I thought about how easy it must be to assume comfort when no one corrects you. How silence can look like agreement from the outside. He had left believing I would keep things running the way I always had. Quietly. Reliably. Without asking for anything in return. I dried my hands on a towel that had grown thin over the years and folded it carefully, aligning the edges. The house watched. The clock kept time. In the bedroom, I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle. The ceiling fan ticked once before falling still. I lay there, eyes open, listening. Not waiting, just listening. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do after the papers are signed is nothing at all. The first time I heard about his new couch, it was from someone else, a woman at the grocery store, balancing apples in a thin plastic bag, smiling like she was sharing good news meant to soften something sharp. "He looks well," she said. "Happy?" I nodded. The cartwheel squeaked as I pushed it forward. I remember thinking how strange it was to imagine him choosing furniture without asking anyone what would fit the room. At home, the afternoon light came in pale and slanted, resting on the same places it always had. The windows were cold to the touch. Winter had begun to settle quietly, the way it always does, without asking permission. I boiled water and forgot about it until the kettle hissed too loudly, startling me. Even small sounds felt bigger now. Or maybe I was smaller. People talked. They always do. I heard about weekend trips, late dinners, laughter that carried across restaurant tables. Someone mentioned a jacket he'd bought, something expensive and unnecessary. Another said he'd seen him out of town, relaxed, hands in his pockets like he had nowhere else to be. He never asked how I was managing, not once. There was a kind of assumption in that silence. A belief that I would continue to hold things steady the way I always had. That whatever I needed, I would quietly provide for myself. I didn't correct anyone, that I didn't fill in the gaps. One afternoon, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. It stuck at first, the wood swollen from age and cold. When it finally slid open, the sound felt louder than it should have. Inside were old receipts, folded notes, envelopes without stamps. Things I'd kept without remembering why. I spread them across the table, smoothing each one carefully. Numbers repeated themselves. Dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what I told myself. I was just sorting, passing time, letting my hands stay busy while my thoughts stayed quiet. Outside, frost had begun to trace patterns along the edges of the glass. The world beyond the window looked softer, muted, like it had learned how to keep secrets. I found a note written in my own handwriting. Just a reminder. A small thing. But reading it now, I felt the weight of how often I'd been the one to remember. Silence settled in as routine. Mornings were slow. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug and watched steam rise, disappearing before it reached anything solid. Afternoons passed with the clock ticking steadily, marking time without urgency. Evenings arrived early, shadows stretching longer each day. I stopped expecting messages, stopped checking the phone the way I used to. When one finally came, it was brief. "Busy week. Hope you're well." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I set the phone down and let it stay quiet. There was comfort in that, too. In choosing not to respond. In letting the space remain unfilled. As winter deepened, the house changed. Pipes clicked more often. The floor creaked under my steps like it remembered other weights, other movements. I wore thicker socks. I closed doors I used to leave open. At night, I listened. The clock, the heater.my own breathing. I thought about how comfort can grow without being noticed, how it feeds on habits formed long ago. How easy it is to enjoy a life built on things you never had to name. He was living well. That much was clear. What he didn't see were the quiet patterns underneath. The way certain expenses had always fallen to me. The way I'd learned to stretch things without complaint. The way I'd stepped back so he could step forward, over and over again. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt something steadier than anger. Something colder, maybe. Like the frost on the windows, beautiful and precise. One evening, I lit a candle and watched the flame steady itself. The room glowed softly, edges blurred. Shadows moved gently along the walls, not threatening, just present. I thought about the word comfort. How it sounds warm, forgiving. How easily it can rest on top of questions no one wants to ask. I gathered the papers back into the drawer and closed it slowly, listening to the wood settle into place. The drawer stayed shut this time. In the distance, a car passed, tires hissing on cold pavement. Somewhere else, he was laughing, ordering dessert, planning another weekend. Here, the house held its breath with me. Silence had become something familiar, almost sacred. And as I blew out the candle and let the room fall dark, one thought stayed with me, quiet but persistent. How long can comfort last when it's built on things no one ever asked about? The clock answered with another steady tick, and I listened, knowing this was only the beginning. The mornings grew heavier without feeling sad. That surprised me. Light slipped through the kitchen window the same way it always had, thin and careful, touching the edge of the counter before moving on. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the house wake itself, wood stretching, pipes clearing their throats. Nothing dramatic, just the sound of a place doing what it had learned to do. I made coffee and forgot to drink it while it was hot. Steam lifted, vanished. The mug warmed my hands even after the taste went flat. I didn't rush anymore. There was no one waiting on the other side of my movements. Clarity has weight that I felt it settle into my shoulders as the days passed. Small memories returned without being invited. Not the loud ones. The quiet ones that used to slip by unnoticed. The time I rearranged my schedule so his would feel easier. The way I stopped mentioning the things I wanted because they took too long to explain. How often I'd nodded instead of speaking. At the sink, I noticed a chip in the rim of a plate and remembered when it happened. Him setting it down too hard, me saying it was fine. It had always been fine. I stopped explaining myself to anyone, neighbors, friends, even my own thoughts. When people asked how I was doing, I smiled and let the question rest without answering it fully. When my phone stayed silent, I let it. I learned how much energy explaining requires, how much space it takes up inside a person. Afternoons stretched. Winter light arrived late and left early, casting long shadows that softened the room. Dust motes drifted slowly, visible only when the sun hit them just right. I watched them without trying to brush them away. There was discomfort in the stillness at first, a sense that I should be doing more. I folded laundry that was already folded, wiped counters that were already clean, paused with my hand on a door handle, unsure which room I meant to enter. The house seemed to notice these hesitations, holding quiet for me until I made up my mind. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on. The rest of the room stayed dark, corners dissolving into shadow. The light pooled over the wood, highlighting scratches and faint rings left by glasses from years ago. I rested my hands on the table and felt its coolness seep into my palms. In that small circle of light, something shifted. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being alone, not of being unheard. That fear had been louder than I'd known. It had followed me through years of careful choices, through conversations where I measured my words, through moments when silence felt like failure. Now, silence felt chosen. I thought about all the times I'd filled space because I thought I had to. How I'd spoken up just to keep peace. How I'd softened truths until they were barely recognizable. The lamp hummed softly. The clock in the hallway ticked, steady and patient. Outside, a car passed, headlights brushing briefly against the curtains before moving on. I sat there and let the quiet stay intact. Memories lined up differently now. Not as regrets, but as evidence. Proof of how much I'd carried without naming it. Proof that endurance can look like agreement if no one asks the right questions. I didn't need to rehearse conversations anymore. Didn't need to imagine what I would say if someone challenged me. The words weren't waiting behind my teeth. They were resting. There was relief in that. I reached over and turned the lamp off. Darkness settled smoothly, without resistance. My eyes adjusted, picking out shapes I knew by heart. The outline of the chair, the edge of the counter, the doorway leading deeper into the house. The floor creaked when I stood. It sounded like recognition. In the bedroom, I lay back and listened to the familiar sounds. The heater clicking on, the faint whistle of wind outside, my own breath moving in and out. I noticed how even it felt now, how steady. Silence wasn't absence anymore. It was intention. I thought about him briefly. About how he might interpret my quiet. How he might mistake it for weakness, for exhaustion, for something that would eventually bend. I didn't correct that thought. I let it be. Resolve doesn't announce itself. It arrives the way winter does, gradually, unmistakably, changing the shape of everything without asking permission. I pulled the blanket up and felt its weight press me into the mattress. The ceiling fan clicked once and went still. The dark held. As sleep edged closer, one truth stayed clear, calm as the ticking clock. When quiet stops being something you endure and becomes something you choose. It starts to speak in ways no one expects. And somewhere beyond this house, beyond this night, I knew the silence was already doing its work. The phone lay face down on the table, dark and quiet, like it had chosen a side. Morning light slid across the wood, stopping just short of where it rested. I watched the dust settle around it, slow and patient, and felt no urge to turn it over. There was a time when I would have checked it without thinking. A reflex. A small readiness to be needed. That morning, I made tea instead. Let the water come to a boil. Let the steam fog the window before I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve. The house felt steady, unmoved. I carried the mug to the table and sat where I always did. The chair creaked like it remembered heavier mornings. I didn't rush. I didn't reach. The message stayed unanswered. At first, nothing happened. Silence often goes unnoticed when it's expected. Days passed in their usual order. Groceries. Laundry. Evenings that arrived quietly and left without fuss. Somewhere else, his routines continued, at least for a while. I imagined him assuming everything was still where he'd left it. Comfort is a fragile thing that IT relies on patterns holding. The next message came 2 days later. Casual. Almost cheerful. Hey, just checking in. I read it once. Then again. I set the phone down and folded a dish towel with careful edges, pressing the crease flat with my thumb. I didn't answer. By the third message, the tone had shifted. Not angry. Not yet. Just confused enough to notice the absence. Did you get my texts? I could feel the question behind the words. The quiet recalculation. I imagined him standing somewhere familiar, reaching for something that wasn't there the way it used to be. That evening, I sat on the couch with the lamp on low. Outside, the sky pressed down in a dull gray, the kind that flattens sound. A car passed. A dog barked once and stopped. The world moved carefully around my stillness. I waited. When I finally picked up the phone, it felt lighter than I remembered. I typed slowly. Erased. Typed again. Each word chosen the way you place stones across water. Carefully spaced, meant to hold weight without sinking. I'm fine, busy day. Hope you are too. Nothing more. I watched the message send. Felt no rush afterward. Just a quiet settling, like setting something down exactly where it belonged. The response came faster than before. Busy with what? There it was, the crack. I didn't answer right away. I let the question sit where it landed. Let it feel its own weight. I rinsed my mug and set it upside down to dry. Straightened a stack of mail without opening it. When I replied, it was brief. Life. The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I imagined his brow furrowing, the way it used to when things didn't line up the way he expected. The way he'd smile afterward, like confusion was something temporary, something I would smooth over if he waited long enough. The phone buzzed again. We need to talk. I leaned back and looked at the ceiling. A small crack ran from the corner toward the light fixture, one I'd noticed years ago and never mentioned. It was still there, quietly holding. I answered when I was ready. We can. Minutes passed before the reply came. When? I thought about the word. How it used to mean now. Immediately. On his schedule. I let my thumb hover over the screen while the room breathed around me. Soon. That was all. For the first time, he listened. Not with patience, but with attention. The messages slowed after that. Each one carried more weight, fewer assumptions. He asked instead of telling. Waited instead of moving forward anyway. I could feel the shift, subtle but unmistakable. A door had closed somewhere he didn't know existed. One evening, the phone rang. I watched it light up, his name steady and familiar, and felt no urgency. The ring stopped. Started again. I let it ring until it didn't. Silence returned, fuller now, charged. I sat by the window and watched frost creep along the glass, delicate and deliberate. Winter had a way of revealing structure. What holds, what breaks, what endures quietly under pressure. I thought about how often my silence had carried him. How it had made space for his certainty. How it had cushioned his steps so he never felt the ground shift beneath him. Now silence refused. It didn't argue that IT didn't explain. It simply stood still. The next message arrived late, stripped of ease. Can we please talk? I placed the phone face down again. Let the room decide the pace. Outside, a streetlight flickered on, casting a pale circle on the snow-dusted pavement. For the first time, I understood something clearly. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means boundary. I rose from the chair and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room gently, without resistance. The house creaked once, settling into itself. As I walked down the hallway, I felt the quiet follow. Not heavy, not sharp, just present. Purposeful. Somewhere else, he was waiting for answers. Here, I was learning how to let waiting do the work. And as the night deepened, one truth stayed with me, calm and unwavering. When silence finally stops carrying someone, they have no choice but to feel their own weight. The meeting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Morning light pressed through the narrow window, stopping halfway across the table like it had reached a limit. I sat with my hands folded, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingers, waiting for something I already knew was coming. He arrived late, not rushed. Just certain. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile meant to smooth over whatever hadn't gone as planned. He didn't sit right away. Set his phone down first. Face up, as if nothing here could interrupt him anymore. I watched him notice the folder on the table. Thin. Neat. Closed. The air felt still, not tense. Just settled. Like dust after it falls. I had imagined this moment before, though never in detail. In my thoughts, there were speeches. Carefully chosen words. Explanations stacked neatly, ready to be delivered. But sitting there, I realized none of that belonged to this room. Silence had already done the work. He cleared his throat. "So," he said lightly. "What's going on?" I slid the folder toward the center of the table. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just enough for him to understand it was meant for him now. He opened it. His fingers paused on the first page. The pages didn't accuse. They didn't explain themselves. They simply existed. Dates. Numbers. Patterns laid bare without commentary. Facts standing where comfort once lived. I watched his face change, not dramatically, just subtly. The way someone's eyes narrow when the ground feels different underfoot. He turned a page. Then another. He didn't look at me. For years, I had carried moments like this quietly. Balanced them carefully so nothing spilled. I'd mistaken that effort for patience, for love, for what women are taught to call understanding. He mistook it for endurance. "What is this?" he asked finally. His voice wasn't angry, .it was smaller than that. I didn't answer right away. I let the question sit beside the papers, let it feel how unnecessary it was. He kept reading, slower now, as if speed might undo what he was seeing. I remembered all the times I'd chosen not to press. Not to question. Not to interrupt the ease he moved through the world with. How often I'd told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. Across the table, his breathing changed. Sharper. Less certain. "You should have said something," he said, without looking up. There it was, the old expectation. I rested my hands in my lap and felt how calm they were. No trembling. No heat. Just stillness. "I did," I said softly. "Just not out loud." He looked at me then. Really looked. As if trying to locate the version of me he remembered. The one who would step in, explain, soften the edges. That woman didn't sit across from him anymore. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself. There was nothing to clarify. The truth didn't need shaping. It didn't need my voice at all. It stood on its own, steady and unmoved. He closed the folder with care, as though sudden motion might make it worse. His shoulders sank slightly, a shift so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely. "So what happens now?" he asked. I thought about the word happens. How it suggests momentum, control, the belief that something would move according to his asking. I met his eyes and answered honestly. "Now," I said, "it's quiet." He didn't smile this time. Didn't reach for his phone. The room seemed to expand around him, filled with the sound of his own breathing, the hum of the lights overhead. For the first time, the silence didn't belong to me. When the meeting ended, there was no handshake. No closing remarks. We stood, gathered our things, and moved toward the door without ceremony. In the hallway, our footsteps echoed differently, mine steady, his uncertain. Outside, the air was cool and clean. The sky had that pale, washed look it gets before evening, when everything feels briefly honest. I walked to my car and sat for a moment before starting it, hands resting on the wheel. I felt lighter, not relieved, just unburdened. The drive home was quiet. Familiar streets. Bare trees lining the road like witnesses who had seen enough to stay silent. When I pulled into the driveway, the house waited the way it always had. Inside, I set my keys down and turned on the lamp by the window. The soft light filled the room without effort. I hung my coat, smoothed the sleeve, noticed how natural the motion felt. The house creaked once, then settled. I made dinner and ate slowly, tasting each bite. Outside, dusk deepened, the world folding into itself. When night finally arrived, it did so gently, without insistence. I sat on the couch and listened. The clock, the heater. My own breathing. Somewhere else, he was sitting with questions that had nowhere to go. With a silence that wouldn't answer him the way it used to. Here, the quiet felt earned. I turned off the lamp and let darkness take the room. It fit differently now. Less heavy, more complete. And as I lay down and closed my eyes, one thought moved through me, clear and steady. Silence had been speaking all along. Only now, at last, someone else was finally listening.